Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah is delighted to welcome this evening's speaker, Dr. Amira Abu Taleb. Intrigued by her relationship between ethics and aesthetics, Dr. Amira Abu Taleb designed a popular course titled Beauty and the Reason in the Arab Islamic Civilization, which she taught at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Amira later taught this lecture at the University of Helsinki in Finland. In her research, Dr. Amira Abu Taleb examines the Quranic concept of ihsan, which translated would mean beauty or goodness. Dr. Amira's work intersects with today's lived realities as she applies her findings to a wide array of fields, including societal ethics, museology, and interfaith dialogue. The highly specialized nature of today's academic scholarship often comes at the cost of a holistic examination. This issue becomes particularly relevant when dealing with art that is a product of a civilization as rich and diverse as that of the Islamic world. In tonight's lecture, titled Theorizing Islamic Art, an Examination of Theological Underpinnings, Dr. Amira proposes a new epistemological theory that perhaps explains Islamic art from a theological perspective. In her lecture, Dr. Amira will examine the interplay between ethics and aesthetics as foundational pillars of the Quranic worldview. The examination of the interplay between humans and mobile phones may also form quite an interesting lecture, but perhaps we should leave that one for another day. So kindly silence your mobile devices and welcome Dr. Amira Abu Taleb.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I'm honored to be amongst you today. And I am particular gratitude to Sheikh Hissa for not only inviting me here today, but for really being a powerhouse behind me continuing this type of examination and my study of this concept of ihsan and beauty several years ago. So I appreciate it and I thank you for being here. So this title seems a little complicated. Yes? Stand here. Yes? Okay, perfect. So let's try to simplify it a little bit. I want to start with this quote by Dostoevsky that says, "Beauty will save the world." Now I want you to think about that for a second. You don't have to agree with it, but I want you to contemplate, what does that mean? When you think of it, what do you envision beauty to be? Some say that this saying is naive and overly simplistic, particularly in the world that we live in today. But you listening to me here today, of all people, by the mere fact of you being here in this institution that cherishes beauty, would be most apt to think deeply about this saying. Well, some of you may wonder, what is meant by the word beauty to begin with? If we look up beauty in our quick go-to Google search, do you know what we will find? Well, let me answer that question for you. You will find an endless stream of entries that take you through cosmetic products, hair salons, and give you weight loss advice. But is that what real beauty entails? Is that the extent of how we perceive beauty today? A skin-deep and superficial self-centered understanding? One reason behind this phenomena is the nature of the world that we live in today, a bottomless materialistic pit of products that flatter our egos. But I'm here to argue that true beauty is much deeper than that. It's not only about the tangible or even about aesthetics, but it's also about goodness and it's also about harmony. In Arabic, this type of beauty is called ihsan, which is a fusion of beauty and goodness together. Unfortunately, this word doesn't have a direct translation in English. In fact, I'm here to argue that real beauty represents the truth that is innate to all of us in its holistic sense. Allow me to take you on this journey through Islamic art and scripture to illustrate my point. The way I would like to illustrate my point is by establishing the proposition that I'm here to make, and then spending the bulk of the conversation about building with you the pieces of what I call the ihsan paradigm in the Quran. So that part of it will be purely theological. But then, the latter part, I want to speak about Islamic art and how that relates to what I had just presented from a theological perspective. But before I do that, there are two important points that I want to mention first. First is, what do I mean when I say Islamic art? Islamic art is a vast world that incorporates different materials, different objects, different regions, different users, and different uses. It can range from something as large as a citadel to something as small as a hairpin. It can be made of stones, ceramics, wood, steel, textile, just to name a few. Furthermore, it can be produced in Morocco or China or Egypt or Iran or anywhere where the Islamic Empire existed. Of course, each artifact is influenced by the styles and the materials and the stylistic traditions of the place it came from. What then can I possibly mean when I say Islamic art and I lump it all together? If we study carefully the different pieces of Islamic art, you will find that there are three predominant motifs that are frequently presented in many of the objects. Anybody who has studied Islamic art or is familiar with it to a certain degree will know what those are. Arabic calligraphy, geometric patterns, and what is called arabesque, which is the floral motifs and vegetal motifs. In many cases, these motifs can be intertwined into a single piece. Sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's a couple. But that's not to mean that all Islamic art is made up of those three motifs. There are other motifs, such as animal figures and human figures, that can be found in different objects and in miniature art. But I also need to stress that I'm not here to say that everything that is produced as Islamic art is made by Muslims, or even believers for that matter. That's not my assumption. What I'm merely speaking about is an overarching phenomena that I refer to here as Islamic art, by focusing on those three main motifs. So I'm sure you're familiar with types of Islamic art that could look like a beautiful dome like this that has a bit of the different, the patterns and the calligraphy. Something like this, which is here in the Dar collection, and that has the vegetal motifs along with the calligraphy, or something like a Quranic folio, a manuscript, that has all three. It has the vegetal motifs and the patterns and the calligraphy. So here's my proposition. The second point, though, before I get to my proposition, is what does a conversation about art have to do with theology? Today, we live in a global world where there's often a disconnect between the secular and the religious. This distinction is also evident in the way art has been usually studied, often relegating it to a decorative phenomena that can be devoid of essence. Art historian Wendy Shaw describes this as a blind spot that afflicts Eurocentric academia. She goes on to state that the European hegemony has made Western modernism a global standard by which everything should be judged. She argues that many modern and secular ideas, particularly those relating to the separation of art and religion, don't apply to the pre-modern and to the Islamic cultures. I tend to agree with Wendy Shaw. Doing so, separating the secular from the religious, separates faith from daily life activities. And that goes against the grain of the Quranic worldview that centers ihsan, which I will be showing you, as a key principle governing our relationship with God and our relationship with the rest of the world. It fuses faith into everyday life. So having said those two things, now I'd like to share with you my proposition. So my proposition is that the Quran concept of ihsan, which combines both beauty and goodness, provides an overarching paradigm that links ethics and aesthetics as part of a greater whole. I go further to state that Islamic art is a manifestation of this art. So what is about this ihsanic paradigm in the Quran? First, let's explain what the term ihsan is. Those of you who are familiar with Arabic know that Arabic, oftentimes the words are based on a triliteral root, so a root made of 3 letters. In this case, it's ha, sin, nun, which is pronounced, some people say husn, but it should be pronounced hasun. And it actually has the lexical meaning when we look at Arabic lexicons, or if we visit pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, you will find that the different morphological patterns of this root all share that meaning that combines beauty and goodness together. Goodness can be goodness in terms of morality, but it also means goodness in a skill set, doing something, mastering a skill set. This root appears 194 times in the Quran, yet I was unable to find it, an academic study that examines it in a holistic and comprehensive, methodical, academic way. Obviously, the different morphological patterns that many of you who speak Arabic would be familiar with are terms such as husn and hasan and hasana and ahsan and husna and ihsan. But that's why it's important to study the concept itself. Because when we understand concepts, our mind allows us to build bridges between ideas. So say, for example, the concept of a chair. If our mind doesn't automatically have an idea of what a chair is, then every time I try to tell a story and it involves a chair, I would have to go and explain that, you know, the material that has 4 legs or maybe 3 legs, and it's something that you sit on. Whereas if I just say chair, you could get to the idea and focus on the story. So concepts are very important because they're the glue that holds ideas together. So I wanted to study ihsan as a concept in the Quran. Ihsan is very predominant in the Islamic intellectual tradition, but oftentimes it comes from the hadith. There is a famous hadith by Hadith Jibreel where Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ is asked to define Islam and Iman and Ihsan. And Ihsan is the third term that he's asked to define, and he defines it as like the highest level of religiosity, where it's as if you're standing in front of God. أعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فهو يراك. So as if you're standing immediately in front of God. So to me, that was very intriguing. It was like, okay, what does that mean? What does it mean from a Quranic perspective? So I wanted to do an analysis, an academic one, that would take me to, you know, the different 194 occurrences in the Quran and see what I come up with. So the methodology is based on a thematic approach, following that route comprehensively and systematically through the 194 occurrences, doing a literary and linguistic analysis of those terms, and identifying key themes within each root, within the verse that it's in, the verses that are surrounding it, and then connecting them to each other. What emerged was a holistic conceptual understanding of ihsan in the Quran. And that's what I'm trying to share here with you today. So the first principle of this ihsanic paradigm is that this notion of ihsan denotes God, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So God is the ultimate ihsan. I share the verses here in Arabic with some translation in English. The translation in English is usually based on Abdul Halim Mahmoud's translation. فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ. So God is described as the ultimate beauty and goodness. But then the Quran speaks of the message, God's message, as one also that speaks to the heart and mind and is one of ihsan. الله نزل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها. I'm not going to go through the rest of it here because of time, but the message that God has revealed is a message of beauty and goodness. Ihsan in the Quran also defines the act of creation itself. In Surah 32, verse 7, the verse says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, الَّذِي أَحْسَنَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقَهُ. So everything that is created, the act of creation itself is an act of making beautiful and good. And this, of course, also is endowed into humanity. لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. Now, how do we understand ahsan in this verse? Depends on the mufassirin that try to, the exegesis that try to explain it based on their understanding. Some people, particularly in the early exegesis, they looked at it as the human form, like the human being standing tall and erect versus animals that walk on all fours or crawl. Later on, some mufassirun said no, it probably means that the human's ability to have emotions. Others said that it's the human intellect that makes them, distinguishes the human race from other creation. I don't know, and I'm not here to do tafsir. I'm here to show that in the Quran, it speaks of the human creation as being one of ahsan make. But then, let me take you just a tiny bit away from ihsan to tell you that this ihsan paradigm is also built on a very important note that is repeated tens and tens of times within the Quran itself. So the Quran repeatedly commands reflection, the people who are listening to the Quran or reading the Quran, to reflect upon this universal harmony that exists. So everything that's created with ihsan, with perfection, with beauty, with precision, then the Quran is laden with verses that ask people to ponder upon those things. So here I will share this one verse, but I will read all of it because it's quite significant to this discussion. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is in Surah Ali Imran. إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لآيات لأولي الألباب الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار صدق الله العظيم. So that these are the signs in creation of the heavens and the earth and in the alteration of night and day for those with understanding who remember God when they're standing, sitting, or laying down, who reflect on the creation of the heavens and earth. O Lord, you have not created all this without purpose. You are far above, so protect us from the torment of the fire. I apologize for the English. No English translation that I have encountered, and I have looked at many, comes anywhere near as close to the eloquence and to the beauty of the Arabic verse itself. But here it renders a bit of the meaning. It's a mandate to reflect and to ponder upon the beauty and the precision and the majesty that exists in nature, so that human beings can discern the divine, can appreciate the fact that there is a creator that is above all of this. And then continuing with this ihsan paradigm, there's a clear mandate in the Quran on more than one occasion. Of course, what I'm sharing with you here are just examples of the verses. There's many more. Of reciprocity, commanding believers to put forth ihsan in their life. So here it says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَأَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ وَلَا تَبْغِي الْفَسَادَ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. So manifest ihsan, which is beauty and goodness, as God has manifested ihsan upon you. And do not seek corruption on earth. God does not love those who corrupt. So if we were to look at it on a visual scale, I would say that it's a spectrum that has ihsan, which is beauty and goodness and the strive for excellence on one end, and on the complete opposite end, it's all forms of ugliness, transgression, injustice. And nature, according to the verses of the Quran, follows this majestic sense of universal harmony. Of course, God is all-encompassing, and then you have the natural world, whether it's the galaxies and the skies, or the little ant and the seed and the ground. These are all mentioned in the Quran as signs of this divine majesty. But then the human being has a sense of agency, a sense of consciousness to try to live within. And believers are asked to live within this sense of universal harmony, to be aligned with this universal harmony by putting forth beauty and goodness. And then there's a stern command in Surah Al-Nahl, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ. This is a mandate. God commands justice and ihsan. So it's not only justice. Believers are not supposed to suffice with justice alone. That doesn't marginalize justice, because justice is a basis for ihsan. But you don't stop at only justice. If we were to look at it visually, I would imagine fairness and justice just as a straight line. But then anything that is transgressive or ugly is a type of fasad or corruption. And therefore, the role of the believer is to pull that side up by manifesting and putting forth beauty and goodness. And of course, in the Quran, it's not only action, but it's actually words and how people interact with each other, with themselves, with God, with creation. Ihsan is also mentioned in the Quran as a criteria for judgment. So here in this surah it says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, إِنَّا جَعَلْنَا مَا عَلَى الْأَرْضِ زِينَةً لَهَا لِنَبْلُوَهُمْ أَيَّهُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. So we have adorned the earth with attractive things so that we may test people. And what is the test? To find out which of them do what is ahsan, do what is beautiful and good. And this is also repeated in different parts of the Quran. So it's the judgment criteria. Finally, the last point or the last principle in this ihsan paradigm that I want to share with you today is the idea that it's a perpetual cycle of ihsan. So the Quran also on more than one occasion speaks of a verse like this in Surah Al-Rahman, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, هَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. It's almost a rhetoric question. Can the reward of ihsan, or beauty and goodness, be anything but ihsan? Again, the interpretation here is up to the mufassirin. Some said, okay, this means that if you do good, in this world, then you will be rewarded with heaven in the hereafter. Some people say, no, if you do good in this world, it means that you will receive good things in this world. Others have said, if you do good, that in and of itself will make you feel good. And that's what goodness here means. Qushayri, for example, switches it all around, and it says the goodness is coming from God. So when God gives this goodness, how can it be received with anything but beauty and goodness from the people? So interpretations are many and ample. But here I'm focusing on the concept itself, just this abstract concept of beauty and goodness and its seminal role in the Quranic worldview. So the key tenets of this ihsan paradigm that I just spoke to you about is that God is the ultimate beauty and goodness, that creation is endowed with ihsan, that there's a sense of universal harmony, okay? There's beauty and precision that exists in all creation around us, whether it's at the huge, galaxial scale or even the tiny, minute atomic scale. And that nature follows this sense of precision and this sense of harmony almost naturally, while human beings have a sense of volition, a sense of choice. Not absolute choice, of course, because that takes us into a whole theological debate, but a sense of guidance, the moral guidance, the fitrah that human beings have, this innate aptitude to be able to discern right from wrong. And then there's a clear mandate to reciprocate ihsan, to offset corruption in this world. In other words, there will always be good and there will always be evil. And it is the role of the believer to spread the good, to break the room for that which is beautiful. And that the assessment is based on the level of ihsan a person puts out in this world, and that putting forth beauty and goodness prompts a perpetual cycle of further ihsan. So that's the ihsan paradigm. In it, God establishes a holistic sense of ihsan as an ultimate ideal. Creation, then, as the beauty and precision of nature, are a path to discern God. Human beings have an innate affinity being created with ihsan, but also, of course, the Quran is laden with messages about the human egotistical tendency towards being distracted from all this, beauty and precision that we see in nature and following, egotistical whims. And the constant reminder in tens, if not hundreds of verses of the need for constant reflection and contemplation to observe the natural world, to observe ihsan and produce ihsan as a means of aligning with universal harmony. So the Quranic mandate for ihsan is literally a command to counter ugliness. This art critic has a famous quote that says, "There is no ugliness in Islamic art." And that is so true. I would just invite you to go take a tour through the Americani Gallery and just look at the beauty of the objects that are in there, whether it's a spoon or a door or a hairpin. And there's just so much beauty abound in all of them. So now I turn to the other part of this talk, which is the ihsan, the Quranic ethic of ihsan and how it relates to Islamic art and aesthetics. Some art critics have claimed that art, Islamic art in particular, doesn't necessarily tell a story. This is going back to this distinction between the religious and the secular. They view it as an endless array of repeated shapes that are not really able to convey a particular narrative. This is often attributed to the fact of iconoclasm, which is the tendency to move away from figurative representation, even though it's important to note that there are many occasions where there is figurative representation in Islamic art objects. So what I'm asking you here is, can the three motifs prevalent in Islamic art, the ones that I've talked about, okay, calligraphy, geometric patterns, and the arabesque, can they be telling a story? And my argument is that yes, they tell a story that mirrors this ihsan paradigm present in the Quran. So let me take you briefly through each one of those three elements and share with you my thoughts. Now here I have to make a very important point. While the part that I presented about theology is an academic, rigorous study that's methodical and comprehensive, that what I'm presenting here are my critical observations about Islamic art. I'm talking about what you find and what you feel and what you sense when you look at Islamic art, but we don't have a record that says this is exactly was the intention of the artist. But I'm speaking from observing thousands of pieces of Islamic art and making a proposal, a theory that you could agree or disagree with. So Professor Martin Lings says that it is a function of sacred art to be a vehicle of divine presence. And even though this seems a bit esoteric and spiritual, I feel like it fits very much with this notion that I'm talking about. So let's start with the notion of calligraphy. When it comes to Islamic art, the concept of the word, al-kalima, reigns supreme. And there's the exhibit of al-kalima al-tayyiba, curated by our very own Mahad, that I would highly encourage you to go and take a look at for how beautiful it is. Muslims believe the Quran to be the exact word of God, and hence the power of the word to convey ihsan lies above all other forms of art. In many cases, artists decorate the object of art using direct verses from the Quran itself. In other situations, poems of reverence and other words of wisdom are utilized. Respect for the written word is so high that it is almost impossible to find a calligraphic script that's on a piece of Islamic art that conveys ugliness. There are many that counter ugliness, counter evil, evoke blessings, but nothing that speaks of ugliness. Or at least I challenge you to look for that. I haven't found it. In his examination of Islamic art, Professor Oludamini Ogunnaike at the University of Virginia states that if it's not beautiful, it simply cannot be Islamic when you look at Islamic art. Of course, that's something that you can argue with, but this is how magnificent the Islamic art is in terms of its reflection of beauty. As God communicated in words, Islamic art thus reveres God in words as well. The use of calligraphy can thus be seen as a reminder of God being the ultimate beauty and goodness, which is the first principle of the ihsan paradigm present in the Quran. Furthermore, the call for goodness that is embedded through the use of verse or through poetry or through words of wisdom, I argue is an embodiment of this call for ihsan. Again, this is a theory that I'm putting out there, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it. Here's another example of a Quranic folio from the Dar collection to just enjoy. Here's a cenotaph, which is an empty tomb, but I want you to look at the detail of the calligraphy. I also want you to note how difficult it is to read. In fact, that's another important feature of calligraphy in Islamic art, is that the ornate stylistic nature of the written text takes time to decipher and to read. The reader thus takes time to be able to decipher and to understand what is written. The beauty of the design creates a complexity that forces the viewer to pause and reflect upon the letters, and hence upon the meaning of the words, in order to break the code and be able to read the script. This call for reflection upon God's creation and upon the words of wisdom is another tenet of the ihsan paradigm that I just presented. And I share this with you to show you how complex calligraphy can be. I don't know if any of you can read this. I'll give you a couple of seconds to look at it. Okay, it says, لا إيمان لمن لا أمانة له ولا دين لمن لا عهد له. No faith for those who are not trustworthy, and no religion for those who do not honor their words. So here is this notion of goodness that I'm talking about. Like the words of wisdom speak of moral values. Oftentimes, I'm not saying that what I'm saying here makes it that, is a generalization that every piece of Islamic art has to have that. And I'm also saying, I'm not saying that what I'm saying is only exclusive to Islamic art. It just happens to be the area that I am studying. But many different forms of art can obviously convey beauty in many ways. So it will be very interesting to do some comparative studies. So now let's go to the geometric patterns. So let me start by nature. Much of the natural world around us is based on geometric principles. These mathematical rules guide the movement of the celestial sphere with its billions of orbiting stars, moons, and planets. Similar systems of geometry lie at the heart of the flower, the most universal model of beauty that exists. For example, if you look at the formation that you see here, at the formation of the heart of the sunflower, you will notice that the rotation is set at an angle commonly referred to as the golden ratio, or phi, which also happens to be a marker in many objects of Islamic art. Depending on the angle that is used and the number of angles in the star, you produce different patterns. Professor of architecture, Abou from Zaytuna University in Jordan, reveals how geometry has an unseen presence in Islamic art and architecture. He says that, quote, it is the visual means by which human minds can comprehend the order and harmony inherent in creation, end quote. Such proportions, along with other geometric formulas, are also present in our own human body and in the atomic cell structure of all natural elements around us. The exact precision and flawless organization that yield all the different types of geometric patterns, depending, of course, on the angle and the degree that it's used, represent a microcosm of a greater cosmos of creation at large. This endless multitude of expanding patterns can also be viewed as a reminder of the infinity that is God and God's creation. It is another way of living in sync with universal harmony by mandating the viewer, of the person looking at those patterns, to understand, to be in sync with this harmony, and to reflect upon the ihsan that surrounds us. So I'll go with you here through some basic features of the geometry that underlies the geometric patterns in Islamic art. It always starts with a circle, sign of infinity, and if you just add additional circles, you start getting different shapes. And depending on the tangents and the lines, the straight lines that you draw between the shapes, then you start getting different formations. And you can go to something like this with an endless, of course, array. But I feel like this is telling a story. And it's not only on domes and ceilings, but it's in this beautiful door that's also displayed here at American. You could see how the geometric patterns are present. Or even in a small box, where you keep the pens. The intricate design is obvious with all the patterns. Here I wanted to share a quote by Ibn Khaldun, who's known as the father of sociology, in his Muqaddimah back in the 15th century, saying, "Geometry enlightens the intellect and sets one's mind right. All its proofs are very clear and orderly. It is hardly possible for errors to enter into geometric reasoning, because it is well arranged and orderly. Thus, the mind that constantly applies itself to geometry is unlikely to fall into error." Of course, this is also a translation from an Arabic that's a bit crude, but you get the idea of how important it is. Now, I get to the last of the three motifs, which is the idea of vegetal art or arabesque. Here, you can see another piece, that's a beautiful piece that's in the Dar collection, that's quite exquisite, and in the middle it says, Ya Hafiz, the protector. While the use of calligraphy and geometric patterns can be understood as a way of connecting us with the higher order of things, the God, the divine, God, the cosmos, in a subtler manner to mark their constant presence in our life, the use of the vegetable and floral motif bring things closer to us, to the tangible and the visible world that we encounter on a daily basis. While this motif adds a free-flowing ornamental accent to a piece of art, as compared to the very highly structured geometric patterns, it's nevertheless representative of mathematical structures that surround us. Seemingly irregular shapes in the world of geometry are called fractals, and they also exist in the natural formation of things, from the way the branches of a tree branch out or to the way the river branches out into streams. Even in the way my fingers protrude from my hand, there's this branching effect of fractals all around us. Bringing the viewer's attention to the majesty that is present and most frequently accessed from nature is another way of Islamic art answering that call for ihsan. Again, I'm emphasizing the idea of just building correlations. This is suggestions that I'm making, and I would love to hear your comments about them. Last but not least, I show with you this Quranic folio that has the vegetal formations, and it has the patterns, and it has the beauty, and it has the goodness and the precision of what I'm talking about. Islamic art, is important to note, is utilitarian. Okay? It's beauty for everyday living. And again, this is not exclusive to Islamic art. It could exist in many forms of art. But it's the art of the daily object. It does not compartmentalize religion, but brings faith into the center of all that one does. The door that you open, the carpet that you sit on, the plate that you eat in, even the tombstone that you could be buried in. This Quranic mandate for ihsan, for beauty and reason, beauty and goodness, compels us to promote beauty and goodness by incorporating them in everything that is said and done. It is a call to become a better human being, one who helps the world by living in sync with the surrounding universal harmony. It's a continual pursuit of beauty and goodness, a fusion of ethics and aesthetics. So I go back to the quote that I started with, of beauty will save the world, and just have you ponder upon it and think about it, and think about it in terms of ihsan. Maybe ihsan can. And I thank you very much for this, for your attention, and I really look forward to your thoughts and questions and ideas. Thank you.